and welcome to the TCDCU weekly meeting podcast.
In our final week of term, as part of Reasons for Hope 2018 and in conjunction with Christian Unions Ireland, renowned author and social critic Dr. Oriel Guinness gave a lecture at Trinity College, Dublin titled Time for Truth, Living Free in a World of Lies, Hype and Spin.
Thank you, Georgie. Thank you all. It's a tremendous pleasure to be back in Dublin and here at Trinity. I was told that some of you who made the scholars tonight are still enjoying the largesse of our family at dinner time, if you wanted. I'm glad to hear that tradition still continues. There are, of course, all sorts of funny stories connected with our family and the family product. One of my favorite stories is actually purely apocryphal. It's the story of a time in the US where some of the major breweries were having a convention and the heads got together at the end of the day's business. Augie Bush, the head of Anheuser-Busch, and Pete Coors, a great friend of mine, head of Coors, and so on. And the waiter came round and asked them what they wanted. Each of them chose their product. Pete Coors, Wretched Coors, Light, and so on. Anyway, they came round to the chairman of Guinness and said, what did he want? And he chose a Coke. And the others looked at him surprised and said, well, why aren't you drinking your family beer? He said, well, you men are not drinking real beer, so I thought I wouldn't either. No, it's a great pleasure to be here. Some years ago, I was talking at Stanford University, and a student asked me a question I'd never been asked before. If you could be a member of any generation except the one you were born in, which would you choose? I happen to be born in China, and I know many of the great Chinese dynasties. I love the Athens of Pericles and the Rome of Trajan and Hadrian. I know well the great 18th century, your own Edmund Burke, and the two Williams, Pitt and Wilberforce, and so on. I'm a great admirer of the American 18th century and their extraordinary revolutionary generation. But what actually came to me in a flash is I'd like to be a member of your generation. Because those of you who are under 35 today, you were described as the crunch generation. In the sense that in our global era, many of the grand issues facing humanity are converging to create a crunch of questions and challenges which will have to be answered in your adulthood. Answer them well, and humanity goes forward calmly. Answer them badly, or not at all, through neglect and drift, and humanity will face extraordinary challenges. We are in an amazing generation. Our Western world is in decline after 500 years. The search for a new world order is very seriously faltering. I happen to live now in the United States. They are experiencing their gravest crisis since the Civil War, nothing to do with the president, but a crisis far deeper than that. And you can see at many, many points, particularly as we look towards the future, in questions like singularity and posthumanism and so on, the questions humanity faces are unprecedented, and your generation will have to tackle them with all the resources that you can muster. Now, one of the questions that's coming up is simply, how do we create societies in the advanced modern world that are free, that are just, and truly encourage the flourishing of human dignity and human worth? Easy to say, but increasingly hard to do. And one of the issues you're going to have to face is the question of truth. Truth. You probably remember just 2 years ago, the Oxford Dictionary described the word post-truth as their word of the year. And then The Economist put it on their magazine cover and emblazoned it for the world. Post-truth. It's been picked up widely across the world since then. But many people just use it as a new fashionable phrase or a new word without really delving into the significance of what's happening in a so-called post-truth world. And that's what I want to do tonight in the short time we have. Just open up some areas we need to think of. For myself, the issue came home many years ago, in fact in 1989, before those of you students were even born probably. But 1989 was described as the year of the century in the last century, the year the Soviet Union fell. And many of us who were older at the time will remember memories of that year. The joyous dismantling of the Berlin Wall. Flowers thrust down the tank barrels of Soviet guns. Or, my own favorite memory, extraordinary rallies night after night in Wenceslas Square in Prague. The Velvet Revolution, addressed each night by a young, boyish, mustachioed figure, later to become President Václav Havel, but then a playwright and a dissident and the leader of the Velvet Revolution. And night after night in his speeches, he painted the contrast between the Soviets and the Velvet Revolutionaries. The Soviets were people of violence. They would be people of peace. But above all, the Soviets were people of lies and propaganda and coercion, KGB. And they would be people of truth. The motto, truth prevails for those who live in truth. At the same time in the Soviet Union, you had Alexander Solzhenitsyn, almost a one-man dissident movement. But think of his famous line in his Nobel speech later. One word of truth outweighs the entire world. Now, at the time, whether it was the revolutionaries in Eastern Europe or Solzhenitsyn in the Soviet Union, the Western world, from left to right, applauded them and celebrated them. But as many pointed out, here in the West, we did not have a similar view of truth on which you could make such a stand. 25 years later, you can see the proud post-truth world and the espousal of all that it means, particularly the notion of the will to power. But I don't think many have yet taken in a deep way the significance of what it means. So we've shifted from a world where truth was important and vital to a post-truth world where it's often derided. Let me open it up by looking at a number of simple areas in the time we have. Each of them could be explored in far, far greater depth, but at least enough to get us thinking tonight and a good basis for discussion. First, think of the sources of this post-truth world. Put simply, they are from philosophy, the history of ideas, from sociology and the whole cultural analysis, and also from technology. When the economists talked about post-truth, they blamed President Trump. But of course the issue goes far wider than President Trump, and the so-called fake news is on the left as well as the right and the center. But more importantly, the issue goes back far, far earlier than President Trump, and you can really root much of it in the thinking of Friedrich Nietzsche and his great writings in the 1880s and his double assault on truth. On the one side, an assault through what he called perspectivism. We call it relativism. As Nietzsche says, there are many I's, in plural, so there are many truths, in plural. There is no truth. Or as Sartre said later, to have a notion of truth, you need an absolute infinite reference point. And of course, for Nietzsche, God is dead, so there was no such thing. Many I's, many truths, no truth. But at a far deeper level, what did that mean? If truth is dead, what we call truth and knowledge is simply forms of the will to power. And you can see that notion picked up his disciples like Michel Foucault in France, and now increasing in the whole postmodern world, where the whole notion of power, 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 and its equations, immediately look around the room, are we diverse enough? And someone will say, we're underrepresented here, and it's a matter of power, and so on. You can see how that notion now is in almost all our Western discussions. The second source was sociology. In particular, the discipline is called the sociology of knowledge. My own mentor, Peter Berger, has a very responsible view of this idea. In other words, the history of ideas, Nietzsche style, moves from thinkers to their thoughts to the impact in the streets. Francis Schaeffer used to call that how ideas wash down in the rain. That's the history of ideas. Sociology of the knowledge works the other way. You start with people's life worlds, the social setting in which they live, the cars they drive, the programs they watch, the cell phones they use, and analyzes how their social world affects even the way they think without any thinker being involved necessarily at all. Now, of course, since Peter Berger and others, that's been taken in a very radical way by the so-called social constructionists. There is no truth at all. Everything is socially constructed. So you can see in our Western world, whether it's Jews or Christians or people who believed in natural law, say the Stoic tradition in the past, they all believed there was a reality out there that had a certain objectivity. Not for the social constructionists. Everything, without any exception, is socially constructed. And of course, much of that centers now around the sexual revolution and the so-called binary battles about male, female, and so on. And you can see how radical that is. There is no objective reality, everything without exception, socially constructed. The third assault comes from technology. When I was a student your age, the little notion, the camera never lies. But of course, since my days, we now have photoshopping, and the camera can very easily lie. Many of you may have seen recently, or heard recently, the speech that John Kennedy gave after he died. He went to Dallas, November the 22nd, 1963, and he was on his way to the trademark to give a speech, a very eloquent speech in terms of the script, but he never gave it. But through the wonders of technology, taking all his separate words from all sorts of speeches, they've recreated it, and it sounds like a live speech, a little bit mechanical, but remarkable with his Boston accent and so on. And you can hear the speech John Kennedy gave after he died. Now, the point being that today the possibilities for fake news and fake everything are almost unlimited. And people have spliced in political leaders they don't like in porn videos or whatever. And you can see today that the collapse of truth in all sorts of areas, through philosophy, through sociology, now through technology, is so profound that we're living in a hall of mirrors, and to really know what's true and what's false, what's a conspiracy theory, what's a rumor and so on, is harder than ever before. Now, I've gone immediately to say we need to take the long-term view of this and remember some of the things that are always solidly reliable, regardless of skepticism. There have been many periods of skepticism before, and there will be again. You take the Greeks and the sophists, who can make black white and white black and up down and you name it. Great thinkers like David Hume in the 18th century, there have been many periods of skepticism, but there's a simple fact: they never, ever last. For a simple reason: human beings cannot live without truth. And you could think very quickly of all sorts of enterprises in our lives that assume and require truth. Very obviously, those of you in the scientific world. The whole notion of science's relation to reality, or something more practical like peer review, would collapse without truth. I used to work for the BBC. If you think for a minute, the whole notion of the press and journalism collapses and becomes a rumor mill if there's no solid sense of truth and responsibility to truth. But the same is also true at a very simple day-to-day level. Our basic human relationships assume and require truth. We can talk very fancily about social capital and the importance of trust, but things like that require truth. If you think every day human societies are built up by people, say, making promises, see you tomorrow, let's have lunch next Friday. We're making a promise to the future in our intentions, not a huge one like a marriage promise or public service oath, but simple everyday promises about tomorrow, future, whatever. And the question is, are we reliable? Do we keep our word? Do we follow through on our promises? And then do we become trustworthy and predictable? Actually, society depends in all sorts of ways on sufficient number of people being predictable, trustworthy, because they are speaking and acting truly. And without truth, human relationships quickly collapse, and you're in a world of suspicion and cynicism, which the postmodern world all too often is. So, in the long run, there's no question there will be a reaction to the skepticism of today, but we're in the middle of the tornado now, and we need to think through the issues very seriously. To those of us who are people of faith, especially the Christian faith, truth is absolutely vital. For two reasons. On the simple side, without truth, people's faith becomes a form of what's called bad faith. In other words, believing something for totally inadequate reasons. We can all think of the skeptics who said that's what faith actually is. Marx's critique that faith is the opium of the people, all the flowers on the chains. Freud's faith as a projection or a wish fulfillment. Jean-Paul Sartre, the notion of bad faith, inauthentic faith, and so on. Now, all those sort of criticisms would be true if faith were not true. And of course, the only final reason to believe is that someone is convinced that what they're putting their faith in is in fact true. True in a profound way, that if it were true, it would be true if nobody believed it. If it were false, it would be false if everyone believed it, but it was still false. In other words, without that element of truth, the Christian faith would collapse immediately as a form of bad faith. Now, sadly, there are many Christians who have inadequate forms of faith. I believe because I've experienced certain things. No, it's not true because they've experienced it. They experience it because it's true. And the same is true in other areas. In other words, the truth is absolutely essential to the faith that would match what Socrates called the examined life. But that's the lesser reason for those who are people of faith. The higher reason is that the Jewish and Christian, the biblical understanding of God, is that He's the God of truth. In other words, truth isn't a matter for philosophers, fancy syllogisms and sophisticated arguments. It's a matter of who God is, the one who is true, who speaks truly, who acts truly, so that behind this universe is a God in whom we can stake our very existence because of the truthfulness of who He is and what He said. Now, of course, the big question today are some of the practical consequences of our post-truth world. And that's what I want to major on. Because increasingly we are in a world where the dangers of post-truth consequences are becoming clear. And one could put this either negatively or positively. But both really need to be taken on board by the generation of those of you at university now. Put negatively, without truth, there is only power and manipulation. Now, of course, you understand that from what I said about Solzhenitsyn and Václav Havel. They could stand against the whole power of Soviet tyranny because they stood on truth and addressed power. But without truth, they would have been outweighed by power in a long way. Now, of course, that's very obvious politically. But it should equally be obvious on a personal level. Take the great artist Pablo Picasso. Genius of an artist, but a monster of a man. And particularly in his relationships with women. His great friend Alberto Giacometti, the sculptor, called him the monster. One of Picasso's mistresses said he would rape us and then he would paint. He himself said, before the film Titanic, "When I die," he said, "it will be like a great Titanic going down." In other words, he was such a devouring, domineering, egotistic character. People came into his orbit and were just sucked into it like a black hole. And when he died, 3 of those in his family and among his mistresses committed suicide. Only one of those close to Picasso's orbit survived him well. And she was his mistress, one of them, 40 years younger. But Françoise Gillot describes how she did it in her own autobiography. She said the only way to survive Pablo was to go in every day like Joan of Arc, she said, she's French of course, wearing the armor of truth. She could not be manipulated if she had a strong view of truth, whereas the others were eaten up by that black hole of his devouring, domineering ego. Now you can take, say, the Me Too movement. Do you recognize while the sexual harassment is vile, much of the complaint against it is actually hypocritical, because it's coming by the very people who celebrated the post-truth world of permissiveness and so on since the 1960s. And clearly, people have greater power, whether they're older, stronger, more handsome, richer, or senior in status. Take Harvey Weinstein in his world of Miramax. Women are there, available. And you can see the logic of the power that was so clearly there in the very philosophy of it. And we need to take that very seriously, whether we're talking about politics, or we're talking about personal relations, or we're talking about universities. Without truth, if there is only power, we are all vulnerable to manipulation. Let that sink in. That's the negative way of putting it. The positive way is not quite so easy to see, but equally important. Without truth, there is no freedom. I was at Oxford with a great Jewish philosopher, Isaiah Berlin. He was famous for his argument that freedom always had 2 aspects: negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is freedom from. If there's anything that constrains us, whether it's a colonial oppressor, whether it's alcohol, whether it's drugs, or a bully, we are not free. We need negative freedom. Freedom from everything external that is constraining us so that we are not free. So negative freedom is essential, but it's only preliminary. The other side of freedom is not negative freedom, but positive freedom. Freedom for, freedom to be, rather than freedom from. Now, of course, you think for a minute, freedom for what? Freedom to be what? You need to know the truth of who you are, what used to be called the telos. The purpose, the end, the objective of what we're here for, to know if we're really free in fully being that. Take G.K. Chesterton's famous illustration. Say you're an animal rights liberator. You go down to your local zoo, intent on freeing all that you find that is unduly caged. And the first 2 animals you see, in one cage is a tiger, has a huge concrete hump strapped to its back, so it's lumbering around very painfully. The second cage, you see a camel. And it's been painted with great rubberized black and orange stripes. So it too is constrained and lumbering around painfully. You want to free them. What do you free them from? Well, you free them both from their cages, because they are wild animals. But you free the tiger from the hump, not from the stripes. You free the camel from the stripes, not from the hump. In other words, you free each according to the truth of what it is. But you can see that much Western freedom today, certainly true in America, is a libertarian freedom that is purely negative freedom. For liberals, get the government off my body and everything to do with sex. For conservatives, get the government off my back economically and financially and so on. And you can see you have people who prize a negative freedom and stop there. Whereas true freedom assumes and requires truth. Are we mere animals? Are we machines? Or are we, as Jews and Christians believe in the biblical tradition, made in the image of God? Depending on the truth, the telos, the end, you have different ideas of freedom, because the fact is that freedom requires truth. And without truth, there is no final freedom. Now we move on though in the discussion, and we've got to face the uncomfortable fact that truth presents us all with a moral challenge. We're at university. You think that everyone in the university, or everyone as a thinker or an intellectual, would prize truth. Certainly you see many great intellectuals and thought leaders who have. Plato, Aristotle, Kierkegaard, many others have had a passionate view of truth. I was brought up in the social sciences. Probably the greatest social scientist is Max Weber. The story about Weber is the exploration of what he was studying led him very close to a breakdown psychologically. He recovered and went on. But one day, some of his friends went into his study and saw Weber pacing up and down, looking worried and deeply depressed once again. His friends said to him, "Max, if your studies lead to such gloomy views and depression, why do you keep on?" And Weber said simply and fiercely, "I want to see how much I can stand." He was passionately committed to truth, regardless. And there have been many great thinkers who have. But if you know the history of thought, you know there have been many great thinkers who have not. And when you examine people like Rousseau and many others, you can see a simple challenge that truth presents to us all. Either we're tempted to conform the truth to our desires, or we're challenged to conform our desires to the truth. That's easy to say, but what do I mean? Take someone like Aldous Huxley, author of The Brave New World. He is incredibly candid, and he speaks actually for many if you look at their lives. He says, when I left Oxford, I decided, noted the word, not I discovered, but I decided the world had no meaning. He said, for me, meaninglessness was an instrument of liberation. I'm quoting him exactly. So he decides the world had no meaning, so that the meaninglessness of the world was an instrument of liberation. If the world had no meaning, he could live any way he liked and create his own meaning. And he says quite straightforwardly, for me and my friends, this is the 1930s, we wanted to live a certain way sexually, long before their time. But you notice what he's doing. He decides it has no meaning, and he uses that meaninglessness as an instrument of liberation, and then lives the way he wants. But read his story, and you can see that the next 10 years, in many ways, he found himself wandering in a wilderness. Now, Bill Clinton, who fell foul of a certain sexual expert as president, He described what his own mother had taught him, which fits in very well, actually, with what Huxley and others have said. Clinton said, I was taught to compartmentalize. In other words, everyone has awkward, inconvenient, embarrassing, shameful parts of their lives. Cordon them off in a compartment and just live as if they're not there. Easy to do. And in the short run, freedom. Everything embarrassing, awkward, inconvenient, compartmentalized, cordoned off, and you live as if it's simply not there. But in the long run, of course, truth will out, reality comes in, and Clinton and many others have discovered the problems of that. People who try and shape truth to conform to their desires. The alternative is tough. Always to conform our desires to the truth. And if the problem is of the first way is compartmentalism, the word for the second way is confession. No, it's facing up to where we've screwed it or gone wrong or whatever. I mentioned Michel Foucault earlier, the great postmodern thinker of Nietzschean power. Michel Foucault, who sadly died of AIDS after early days in the San Francisco bathhouses, he did not like the Christian faith. But he often said there was one thing about the Christian faith that he admired, and that was confession. Why? I've never seen it the way he put it. Foucault said, as an atheist, what he admired about confession is that someone, when they voluntarily confess, not a false confession, when they voluntarily confess, they're going on record against themselves, which is a very rare moral act. Usually we present our best face, put the best foot forward, and everything a little shame, the skeletons are well kept into the closet. No, in confession, I screwed up. I sinned. I lied. I cut a corner. I did this. I did that. And you own up to it. In other words, shaping our desires according to the truth rather than trying to shape the truth according to our desires. But of course, there is reality, and while that's the more painful way in the short run, it is the far fuller and freer way in the long run. So I'd urge all of you, particularly those of you who are still at Trinity now, to think through this question of truth and come to your own solid conviction. One of the wonders of history, in a sad way, is there is so little objection to ruthlessness through history. That's simple to say. The Mesopotamians, you cannot argue with the palace. The palace is always right. The Roman writer Tacitus, the gods are on the side of the stronger. Stalin, when Churchill urged him to think of the Vatican, how many divisions does the Pope have? Or famously in the 1960s, Mao Zedong, power grows out of the barrel of a gun. You can look down through history, and sadly, very few voices have been raised against the ruthlessness of power. Which means that many people were obedient and were obsequious to power. And the fact is, there is a spectacle of power before which too many people bow. Some of the greatest voices and the earliest voices were the Hebrew prophets. And you can see their anger against the abuse of power, and particularly the oppression of the poor and the weak and the orphan and the widow and the stranger, are some of the strongest voices in all history, because they grow out of the fact not just that God has made people in his image, but that God himself grieves and is angry when people made in his image are oppressed and subject to injustice. Where do you stand on this? Unless you have a solid view of truth today, you cannot address truth to power. And we're in a world of manipulation, of power games, milder, stronger, severer, moderate, whatever. And there is no recourse to it. Whether you're reading the newspaper, or listening to politicians, or fighting to some cause yourself, unless you have a strong view of truth, you will not be able to stand. So for those of us who are followers of Jesus, truth is fundamental, truth is precious. But for me, the wonder of it is, as you look at this whole modern discussion, read the great thinkers like Nietzsche. Look at people who stood against truth, with truth, like Solzhenitsyn and so on. You actually work your way back to where Jesus spoke all along. And you remember what he said to his disciples, not just that he himself was the truth, but he said that if people followed his teaching and his truth, they would know the truth, and the truth would set them free. In other words, the call of Jesus of Nazareth is strong, not just to know the truth, that can be abstract, but to live in truth. And even more challenging, to become people of truth. But in the world increasingly given over to the insatiable and incorrigible and idolatrous spectacle of power which our world is becoming, however small we are, we can be people of truth and stand for truth and know that that is the way to address power, and that is the way to find a full and fulfilling freedom. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. The tragedy of our Western world is that is the most popular university motto in the world. The truth will set you free. The words adorn the walls, but the truth no longer animates the mind and the heart. And that's what we're talking about tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guinness, for a most sobering, inspirational, and for many of us, aspirational talk. My name is Ken Mock. I'm currently an academic at the School of Biochemistry and Immunology. I humbly represent many of the academics here who are always in awe of the DUC, the University of Dublin, or Trinity College of the Christian Union, who do many wonderful activities to inspire all of us. As you know, April is a difficult time for these students, the committee members. There are the upcoming annual examinations, and they just recently had a peaceful regime change. So it's me to come up and would like to now open this floor for questions. I think we have a mic here. You can wrap it and drop it if you want, but
doesn't seem to be one. Is there a control for this? I don't know. Okay, let's go. Yes, over there at the back. Okay, then let's try speaking up with our own voices.
Are you talking about the decline of the West?
Sing it out a bit.
when you're talking about the decline of the West, do you think it's overall or it's just certain countries? And my second question is, do you think the real problem is more the confusion between trust and trustfulness, truth and trustfulness?
I can't hear that.
Okay, so in terms of the West, the decline of the West, the question was whether you think this is only allocated to a few countries or maybe in general, and whether there's a differentiation between trust and truthfulness. The other way, truth and trustfulness.
I think the crisis of truth is far wider in the West. But the West, let's take the West for a start. We owe a huge amount to the Greeks, in all different reasons. We owe a considerable amount to the Romans, ranging from governance to central heating and roads. But the West owes the most to the Hebrews and to the legacy of the Bible. And you can think of things like human dignity and freedom and various other things like this, which go back directly to the Bible. One of those notions, although there's an overlap with the Greeks and with the Romans, is the notion of truth. And you have the deepest, strongest view of truth there. But ever since the Enlightenment, there's been a systematic attempt to cut off those Jewish and Christian roots. So that the Western world today is something of a cut flower civilization. We still, in many areas, believe in human dignity, freedom, various things like this, but the roots are being cut, and now that's happened with truth. Now, of course, you can see the crisis of truth, or the consequences playing out, far wider. So, I grew up in China, and there's no question in China that, I quoted Mao Zedong, power grows out of the barrel of a gun. They never had a high view of truth in their communist ideology, and so everything today in China is a matter of power from the state downwards. And so the crisis of truth is far wider than the West. But we in the West have very particular roots of it, and I think we need to examine these roots. Do they matter? And does it matter that we're carelessly tearing up these roots and throwing them out? Another issue I'm passionate about is freedom. So, for example, I'm in Oxford. I'm 75 yards from the house where the good Richard Dawkins lives. Now, if you look at the so-called four horsemen of atheists and so on, Dawkins, Sam Harris, people like this, they literally have no grounding for freedom. Beginning with naturalistic science alone, you cannot come to a scientific grounding for freedom. So Sam Harris, freedom is an illusion. But go on down the line. Truth, dignity, freedom, justice. We are cutting the roots of these things, and it sounds fine. The brave new world, and we can have skeptics here and skeptics there, and doubtless there are some here at Trinity. But as we play out the consequences, society, in families, and in politics, then we'll begin to see what we've done. So you're right, the crisis goes far wider in the West, but it's a very particular form we're addressing in the West. Thank you.
Any others? Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering.
Sing out so that you
Can you speak up, please? Let's see if that microphone works.
Does it work? Okay,
good.
I was wondering, could you maybe speak to us about where you see the Christian church today in this society, maybe not just in the West, but in general, because I know it does appear to be growing in places like Southern Africa and China. So
these are generalizations. The church is exploding in the so-called global South. Sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and so on. And also in Asia, where I happened to be born in China, in north-central China, is the epicenter of the fastest growth of the Christian church in 2,000 years. And the story in Dr. Mark's career and so on is quite remarkable. So you can see the extraordinary growth of the Christian church, also true in parts of Latin America. But, we've got to be honest, not in the advanced modern world of the West. Now, the sting in the tail of the story of the church's growth in the global south is that much, not all, but much of the global south is pre-modern. And what is done in the church in the West is its capitulation to the distortions and seductions of the advanced modern world. Now, that's nothing to do with ideas like Nietzsche and so on, but to do with the shaping power of modern institutions. So, sadly, there's nowhere in the West where the church is really flourishing as it is elsewhere. And we've got to face up to that. Now, those of us who are followers of Jesus, can the church prevail over the toughest challenges of modernity? I would argue yes, but we've got to demonstrate that in practice in the Western world. And we need the help of brothers and sisters from China and Africa and so on. They have a courage and a boldness and a power. Do you take something like the supernatural? In the traditional world, what was unseen was not unreal. It was more real than the real world, the world of the five senses. But in the modern world, what's unseen is also unreal. When we talk about the real world, the world of business, science, technology, that's not what the traditional world or the Bible would call the only real world. In other words, in the West, many Christians are about as secular as their atheist next door neighbors without realizing it. They're functional atheists. And you can see many ways our Western world is shaped by modernity, or it is by the gospel, and that's sad. But no reason to be discouraged. We can see what's happening elsewhere.
Following up on that question, how would you interpret the Bible Belt of the United States in that context?
That's a very different phenomenon. Sadly, you can see this in Northern Ireland, and you can see this in the Bible Belt in the United States. When you have cultures under stress, they often take to forms of religion that are reactionary in tone and dig their heels in. You can think of, say, the reform movements against slavery in the United States. Some people dug their heels in all the more. So the irony was, the abolition movement was led by Quakers and then by evangelicals like William Wilberforce and so on, but it was also some of the conservative Southerners who dug in their heels and became pro-slavery and tried to give it biblical rationales. The same thing sadly happened with apartheid in South Africa. So cultures under stress are often tempted to take to unbiblical forms of conservatism that become an ugly fundamentalism, are a stain on the church. But you can see forms of bad religion, all sorts of places. And let's say with sadness, as Irish people, that's what's happening here. Now, we only need to see examples in history with France. When the church dominated in the 4th century under the Emperor Theodosius, who declared Rome Christian, sadly, it didn't go back to biblical forms of leadership and structures. It borrowed the structures of Rome. The Roman structures were not like the Old Testament covenantal. They were hierarchical. And when hierarchical structures of power are corrupted, they become oppressive. And the problem with power, it doesn't just oppress the weak, it corrupts the powerful. And the most famous statement about power was actually by a Catholic layman, Lord Acton, who was challenging people who wouldn't criticize the Pope. And he said, famously, all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And sadly, the church of the medieval world borrowed Roman structures, the Pope, like the Caesar, and produced later the Inquisition, terrible things like error has no rights, the forced baptism of the Jews, and these profound evils. So much so that if you look at the big hierarchical kingdoms in Europe, supremely France, what happened in the revolution? Diderot gave his famous cry, "We will never be free until the last king is strangled with the guts of the last priest." In other words, you had church and state, throne and altar, in collusion, both corrupt and both oppressive, throw off both. And that, of course, is the tragedy of Ireland. And when the corruptions of the church were unmasked, the revulsion against the church has been palpable, and the rise of secularity in the light of that. And you have milder versions of that in the Bible Belt in the United States. So wherever you have corrupt forms, whether mild or moderate or severe, like in France, you get a powerful reaction, which is partly very understandable. In other words, put another way, European secularism has a major root, which is reactions to corrupt Christian state churches in the past. And that's why I would argue we need to go back to far deeper understandings that are biblical in terms of human dignity, of justice and freedom, and challenge both some of the secular alternatives, but also some of the Christian vices of the past.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, Andrew.
I think many people would agree with the whole overall pitch of the lecture that we need to get back to truth, and people I think of Christian faith or other faiths or no faith would agree with that. The problem sometimes is though that people's discussion of what actually is truth and what is truth. So I'm wondering, do you think that truth is self-evident, or are there ways you can suggest that people can pursue truth to try to, I suppose, test things whether they're true or not, outside of the scientific method? Because a lot of scientists would probably have the view that the only real truth is what could be measured and what can be scientifically assessed.
No, I think very patiently and humbly we need to go into how people can look at the whole issue of truth and come to an understanding of it, and that'll differ. Someone's a philosopher, someone's a lawyer, someone's a physicist, or whatever. And lawyers talk about due diligence. The man in this person in the street talks about checking it out. Philosophers talk about theories of verification, falsification. No, there are different ways of looking at it, but one needs patiently to go into that to give people an invitation to look at it. Now, if we're looking supremely at, and for followers of Jesus, that's looking at Jesus himself and the understanding of God in the light of Jesus, it comes in its place. In other words, for a seeker, stage one is always a time for questions. Someone has to be interested in issues, even to start thinking about it. Most people aren't even be apathetic today and unconcerned. So stage one is a time for questions. Stage two is a time for answers. That's comparative. You can look at atheism, what it offers. You can look at, say, Buddhism. You can look at biblical answers. They're all different. Sort of weigh each of them up. If I was to believe this, what then, and so on. A time for answers is comparative, and the central issue there is adequacy. Whichever answer, worldview, faith I was to believe, would it be adequate to answer the questions I have in stage one? Then comes the important part that you're talking about, stage three, a time for evidences. All right, I have my questions. It looks as if this answer would be incredibly adequate, illuminating, if I were to believe it, but how do I know it's true? Time for evidences. Now, usually you can see that at that stage is there's one of two ways. Either a big picture way, where the coherence of the Jewish Christian answer fits all the big questions of life. And a good example of that is the big Catholic apologist G.K. Chesterton. You ever read his story? When he discusses, and for him, he wanted to have an answer to why was there light in the world as well as darkness? You had to explain the light and the darkness together. The good and the bad, the brokenness and the beauty. You know, he was tempted to be a cynic when he was at Art College in London, and he says, I was stopped in my tracks by a dandelion. No, it's the beauty of simple things in a world of wickedness. How did you explain both? And in his biography, when he describes this, it's almost like eureka. He's a brilliant writer anyway, but 2 pages are just, they crackle with life. He sees everything fitting in. It's this big picture way. The truth is coherent. It answers this and that and the other, and all the pieces of the puzzle, like someone suddenly seeing how it all fits and the pieces all sit in. So that's one way, coherence, that big picture way. The other way, a good example is C.S. Lewis, one of your Irishmen. And for Lewis, it was that close-up, detailed, painstaking, checking it out in terms of the evidence. And you remember his story. You know, people at Morton College tell him, hey Jack, have you ever read the Gospels? Literary critic, he hadn't really. When he looks at the Gospels, though, it doesn't fit what they were saying. They were saying, hey, look, Jesus is a great ethical teacher. Lewis looks and says, wait a minute, yes, extraordinary ethical teacher, love your enemies and so on, but saying things which, if not true, would make him a nutcase. And you remember his famous way of putting it. Notice he looked at it in a very close-up way until he was convinced by the evidences, and he described himself as the most rejected convert in England. Why? Forced by the evidence of the truth. So there's always the big picture way, or the close-up, more detailed way, but we should invite people patiently to look into the truth. It depends on where they come from, a legal background, philosophical background, scientific, and so on. You know, one of my friends in Washington, D.C. is the great scientist Francis Collins. It's exactly how he came, and he's famous being the head of the Genome Project, and now he's the leading scientist in America as the head of the National Institute of Health. He describes patiently how checking out the evidence as a scientist that convinced him that Jesus was in fact Lord and God. So your point's an incredibly important one. Now, of course, you have to add, the truth by itself doesn't make someone a believer. There has to be a commitment of the whole person, and that would be the fourth stage.
Kevin, yeah.
Would you agree with an opinion or disagree that history is a record of winners instead of record of truth? And why and why not?
Partly that's right, because you could say that history is the story of what human beings have done with power. Now, we've equally got to say, what about our Western tradition of reforms and a passion for justice, which you can trace back not just to Hebrew prophets, but back to Exodus, let my people go, and so on. You have there the basis for truth and justice standing against power. And my point is, without that, truth and justice, you would have only power. In other words, the winners, who not only win, but they write history. No, that's exactly right. So, the danger in other words, what you just said, many people will say, if there were lions, lions would have written the story of the universe from the lion's point of view. But humans, a little wiser than lions. In other words, the winners always write history. But underlying that is the notion of attacking that there is only power. And that is what we must never allow. And certainly those of us who are followers of Jesus, or people who take the Bible seriously, there is truth. There is justice. God cares passionately about injustice. Read a book like Amos, you know, the wealthy grinding the faces of the poor, selling the poor for shoes, and so on. God is angry about that. There is a counterbalance to power, and without truth there isn't one. No, your point is good.
Does freedom require a secular society?
No. No, but we've got to, in other words, over against the oppression of the state churches, like France and so on, we've got to have freedom from that. But for a solid view of freedom, how do you do it? That, as I said at the very beginning, is the challenge. How do we, in the chaos of politically and other ways today, fight for a society that takes human dignity seriously, so there's genuine human flourishing? That's the enlightened word, biblical word, shalom. But is based on human worth, on genuine freedom, and so on. For example, my freedom assumes at least two things. One, a self-reliance in terms of character and truth, so that, as Lord Moulton put it well, freedom is obedience to the unenforceable. But on the other, that's the internal freedom. But externally, my freedom is no more free than my respect for your freedom, and your respect for David's freedom, and Ken's freedom, and everybody else's freedom. Of course, that's our challenge today. Many people want their own freedom. They don't care about other people. And, if you've got 3 people in a room, relatively easy to figure out how 3 people each have freedom and space. If you have 300 million people in a room, like America does, how do you figure out that one? And you can see many of the problems of freedom come in terms of others who may have very different views and so on. So we've got to figure, it's not a discussion, but that takes into account, say, not just freedom, but freedom of conscience and so on. So I'd love to discuss that one sometime, another jujitsu. I would argue that secularism, I mentioned Sam Harris, there isn't one of the leading atheists today who can give you a grounding for freedom at all. Now, as we look back to the Mesopotamians, people were ruled by fate, the stars. We look at the Greeks. Moira, fate and destiny, is even behind the gods. We look at modern determinism and naturalism. There's no freedom. It's scientifically determined, psychologically determined. You have Marxian determinism, very economic, psychological, whatever, chemical, whatever it is. I don't know another grounding for freedom except the Bible. Now, it's easy to say as a word, but Christians have got to, and Jews have got to unpack that together and show what it means and then live it. So I would argue that in the secular ways, they are undermining freedom today. They are not establishing it.
Yes.
How do you, if you believe in objective truth, communicate with somebody who only, or says they only believe in subjective truth?
Yeah, good question. I mentioned my mentor, Pete Goethe, who's behind the social construction of reality in a responsible way. He puts it very simply. 2 arguments for the extreme relativists. Number 1 is negative argument, number 2 positive. The negative argument is relativize the relativizer. In other words, they will say everything's relative. Depends on your class, your age, your generation, your background. No. Relativize it. Don't argue with them. Say, let's be true to what you say is true, complete relativism. At a certain point, they won't be. No one can live with a complete relativism. No one. So I would just take them seriously and drive them slowly to see the consequence of what they're doing. Among other things, the problem I said, without truth only power. No, the relativists can't argue against that. The only arguments against power to have more power. But the fact is that most of us simply can't. We're less wealthy than Bill Gates. We're less powerful than Donald Trump, or whatever it is. In other words, if there's only power, you have to have more power or you're stuck. No, if you have truth, one man can stand against the entire world. The salt in its head. So relativize the relativize. So that's the negative argument. Berger's positive. It's what he called point people to the signals of transcendence. What did it mean? Everybody, somewhere in their life, has experiences which actually point beyond what they're saying, puncture what they're saying, and point beyond it. Simple example is C.S. Lewis. He was an atheist. What cracked his atheism? He said he was, quote, surprised by joy. Not pleasure, not happiness, joy. It punctured what he believed as an atheist. And for more than 10 years, he became a seeker looking for an answer to ground that joy, and then found it in his faith in God. And I know a whole number of my favorite examples, W.H. Auden, if you know that name, the English poet. In his 20s, he was left-wing, atheist, and gay. And he fought against Franco in the Republican Civil War, and defeated. Went to America to escape World War II and all that. Here he is, though, left-wing, atheist, gay, living in New York. The only way to follow what's going on in Europe is to go to the cinema. No television, so you watch the Pathé documentaries. And one Saturday night, the documentary is on the siege of Poland, and he didn't realize he was in a part of Manhattan Well, it was a German-speaking audience, and of course America was neutral, and many people were on the German side, certainly in this group. And they watched the siege of Poland, and Orden sat there in the darkness. The SS troops were bayoneting women and children, and the German audience shouting out, kill them, egging on their fellow countrymen. And Orden sits there in the darkness, says, in 5 minutes my whole worldview was overturned. I never thought humans were evil. I could see that we are evil. But he said the real problem was, I needed an absolute to say that Hitler was absolutely wrong. I knew he wasn't relatively wrong. He was absolutely wrong. But as a European intellectual, he said, there were no absolutes. Only crazy fundamentalists believed in things like that. He said, I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute and met Jesus. Now, that intuitive sense, there must be an absolute as something is absolutely evil. That implicit judgment is what Berger would call a signal of transcendence. An experience which punctures what people believe and point them beyond. And if they're honest, they start to think and then search. So, relativize the relativizer. And secondly, positive, point them towards the signals of transcendence in their own experience. Yes?
Yes, kind of following on that. Would you like to comment on the phrase? Would you like to comment on the phrase referring to Jesus, that whose service is perfect freedom? From the Book of Common Prayer.
Yeah, oh no, absolutely. I was going to say you're quoting the Book of Common Prayer. His service is perfect freedom. I love that, Christian. If you read Exodus, which is the master story of Western, certainly of English-speaking freedom, the Jews dare to use the same word, avodah, for the slavery of the Pharaoh and the worship of God. But of course, for Pharaoh it was slavery, and for God it was a service that was perfect freedom. In other words, that's the freedom from Pharaoh and all that, but the freedom for discovering who God is, who He's made us to be, and the life we're called to live in, knowing justice and these other things. It's freedom. So His service is perfect freedom. Cranmer's words are absolutely wonderful in that way. But we've got to demonstrate that, those of us who are followers of Jesus. No, great thing. This side of the room's been conspicuously silent. Maybe it hasn't had a chance.
To your right, yeah.
Dr. Guinness, in light of what we're talking about, and the struggle that's going on for truth and whatnot, C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity said Christianity is a fighting religion. And kind of in the same context, he spoke about certain points of view being damn nonsense. And do you think we have retreated to a softly approach to confirm or to putting forth truth? We're more concerned about appearance than about getting the truth into the public market.
If we look at Jesus Himself, you have truth with grace, as the Gospel of John says, or the New Testament calls us to speak the truth with love. In other words, you have that incredible balance in Jesus. Now, I think we each have to ask ourselves personally and then culturally, if you look at truth and love, which side are we, either personally in terms of personality or culturally in terms of background, liable to topple over? In a truth without love or a love without truth? And we have to ask ourselves, let's be blunt, Lewis knew well, he came from Ulster. Some of the Ulstermen can be very dogmatic and fighting in a way that's really ugly, and often have. And it's a truth without love. And there are others in other parts of the world, or by personality, who so much put love, they're indifferent to truth. And that's absolutely disastrous. So love and truth cannot be separated. And if we look even in the Old Testament, many people say the New Testament's the story of love and the Old Testament's the story of law. The Jews hate that, understandably. Hear, O Israel, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, etc. And you're so called to love God that not to follow his way is adultery. Apostasy is adultery. So a failure of truth is not just some finicky thing for theologians or whatever. It's a failure of love. People have lost their first love. So even in the Old Testament, you have truth and love. And certainly you have that even more strongly in the New Testament. So I would say we have to examine ourselves and see whether we're the fighting sort. We need to balance it with a lot of love. Or whether we're the very loving sort who really need to stand with a lot more courage to something. And today there's no question which the general public will go. In an ecumenical age, a relativistic age, an indifferent age, and who am I to claim, whatever. More people compromise truth today than compromise love. That's true. But other people fall over backwards the other way to try and compensate for all the rest of us. And they're really ornery and fighting people. So I say we have to examine our hearts before the Lord and see if we have that balance of truth and love.
So you could fall off either side of the horse.
What?
You can fall off either side of the horse.
That's right. Was it Martin Luther or someone that said, like a drunkard, would fall off one side, we clamber up and fall off the other side. But we need to hold that balance. And that's what we need friends for. Tell us if we're straying too much one way or the other way. My wife is not here tonight, but when she's with me, she always tells me, which side I'm here, falling on one side or the other. We all need people like that who speak the truth to us bluntly, but in love. Keep appealing to someone on this side.
Yes. In the back,
Yeah.
Very in the back, yes.
Kind of following on from what was just asked there, how do you think Christians can balance the concept of tolerance with truth? So must we divide or choose between one or the other? Or how do we communicate tolerance in an age of intolerance?
Personally, I don't put a lot of stock on tolerance as a word, as a term. Because if you think of tolerance and the way it came up in the 18th century, John Locke and others, tolerance itself depends on power. It's the strong who tolerate the weak. It's the majority that tolerate the minority. It's the government that tolerates the citizens. A better view of freedom is actually based on respect for freedom and freedom of conscience. In other words, freedom of conscience is something that's a real principle, and we respect it in each other. We don't just tolerate it in each other. So personally, I don't use the word tolerance that much. Now, certainly tolerance is better than the opposite, intolerance. But tolerance is actually very condescending, very power-based itself. And if you start thinking of respect, I'm meeting another person, I have to respect their understanding, I have to respect their freedom before God, I have to respect their freedom of conscience, and so on. A fundamental respect based on principle, I think, is a far stronger way than tolerance. Because, as we know today, since it's based on power, tolerance very quickly flip-flops into intolerance. So you can look, say, there's a certain type of liberalism today which is highly illiberal. It talks inclusiveness, except certain people, it doesn't exclude them. It talks diversity, but on its own terms, and then flattens out all the differences that don't fit in with its ideas, and so on. And there's a liberalism to me that's incredibly intolerant while using the word tolerance. So I think we've got to challenge the power basis of that and talk much more about principle and respect. That would be a quick answer to that one.
Any others? Yes. Could you speak up, please?
Jesus said, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And I'm wondering sometimes, why is the church teaching a soft gospel?
Why not?
Why is the church sometimes today teaching a soft gospel? You know, now we know the love of Jesus, absolutely, I have no doubt about that. But even Jesus went into the temple and he did throw out the money changers and he even made a whip. I'm not saying to do that, but I'm just saying, are they afraid of losing some of their congregation? And are they not giving the congregation the benefit of the doubt? Are they thinking that they're really, oh no, we want to keep them innocent, or, you know, they're not really sometimes acknowledging that they're intelligent people. You know, we're not all intellectuals, but we are intelligent because we have the mind of Christ. And also, he said, as in the days of Noah, so it shall be when the Son of Man returns. Now, I'm sure today, it is happening today that scientists, you know, some of them are Christian, they are messing with the gene pool. And you have the epigenetics, you have transhumanism, and you know, there's all of that going on. And is that being acknowledged by the church and being taught, and you know, for people to really know? I don't know. So they're all my questions.
Five-word answer. No, you've raised an important point. It touches on the same one that Nikki raised on from over here. Yeah. I don't know your local churches. Clearly, churches have to have truth and love. And we all know there are many churches that have gone overboard on love and have no truth left. But there are other churches that are so harping on certain aspects of the truth, they're almost ugly in the way they do it. And so I can't comment on local ones, but we have to ask ourselves, do we have the full, what the Bible calls the full counsel of God, and so on, with truth and always with love. So there's no question our Lord never minced words, and he's never angrier when he faces religious hypocrisy. And I thank the Lord for that, because your generation, they talk of authenticity and so on, but often without a standard to what's true. You can't have anything authentic unless you know what's true and what's counterfeit and what's insincere. There is no greater counter-hypocrisy in history than Jesus. And he talks very bluntly when he talks about whitewashed sepulchres and so on. And there are times to talk like that, because there are evils in the world and in the church that need to be named for what they are without any mincing of words. And there are times to speak as bluntly as that. But we have to ask ourselves, when we do that, our Lord could do that without tipping over. Do we tip over one side or the other? Do we do it with tears? I mean, clearly the prophets spoke extremely bluntly, but they did it with tears. And they were often rejected for doing it, and so on. So there's always a cost to it. But it's the same basic answer as to Nikki's earlier, that wonderful balance. Now, the second half of your other question is huge. When I was a student, 50 years ago, the question raised, I was at London University as an undergraduate and Oxford as a graduate, is there a future for humanity? That was actually Bertrand Russell's book. And they put it like this: we are today living post-Auschwitz. What does it say of us as human beings? The people who did that are the same species we are. But we're not only post-Auschwitz, we're post-Hiroshima. And the only answer to the bomb is mutually assured destruction. Mad. What does it say of us? That we have to be mad to stop ourselves blowing up people off the earth. But now we're not only post-Auschwitz and post-Hiroshima, we are pre-singularity, as you were discussing. In other words, if you read the discussion, posthumanism and all that stuff, they are saying the only thing that holds us back from becoming godlings, gods on earth, literally, there's words, are those who believe that life is sacred. In other words, the greatest barrier to the greatest advancement of humanity is the notion that people have a sacred human dignity. Now, where does that come from? Obviously, the biblical view. And if any of you have been in any of these discussions, you can see how important the world is that we're going into. One of the great differences between the so-called uns and ends, if you've heard that one. The unenhanced and the enhanced. Now, in that world, the question is, what is human dignity? Truth comes in again. What difference does it make that humans are made in the image of God, etc., etc.? So my point is we've got to be in the thick of those debates. And I go down to Silicon Valley and places like that. That's what they're discussing now. The sad thing is many people of faith are not in those big discussions. We've got to be, because our views of humanness are incredibly important.
Speaking of human dignity, we find these truths self-evident. So says the founding fathers of colonial American times. So that is the idea of democracy, the truth in democracy. How does that compare or correlate with the truth in the Bible, biblical truths?
Philosophically, they could say that in the 18th century. No one would say that today. There are no philosophical truths that are self-evident. None. They all have to be articulated, argued, examined, looked into, and so on. That idea of the self-evident truth that Jefferson talked about in the Declaration is impossible today. Now, take human dignity. We have to unpack, not enough just to say, made in the image of God, stop. We've got to unpack that. It's a remarkable idea. I haven't time to do it tonight, but that's one of the key issues of the future. We've got to unpack it, we've got to live it out. There's no higher view of human worth, significance, dignity than you have in the pages of the Bible. Now, personally, I don't put much store on democracy. I hope this doesn't surprise you, Ken. You know, I think democracy is deeply in trouble. I think a biblical understanding of government is far deeper than that. For the Americans, for example, we're not in America tonight, but their notion of constitution goes back to the Jewish covenant. Their notion of republican is far, far deeper than democracy. For instance, if you look at the covenant in Exodus, there are three simple things that shape politics. One, consent of the government. 3 times it says in Exodus, all that the Lord says, we will do. Exodus is not a theocracy. That was an unfortunate word put in by Josephus. It's a nomocracy, the rule of law, which the people buy into, freely chosen consent. Secondly, a morally binding pledge. A covenant goes beyond a contract or a compact. It's not purely legal, it's that moral element that's there. But thirdly, the key thing, it has a reciprocal responsibility of everyone for everyone. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's said once in Leviticus. Incredibly powerful. 35 times it says you love and care for the stranger. The stranger is not in our image. People like us, as Aristotle says. The stranger, he or she may not be in my image, but he or she is in God's image, and therefore I care for them. Now you unpack some of those simple ideas. Where does the separation of powers come from? The Old Testament. You had the king, the priest, and the prophet. The prophet was the social critic, calling the other two back to the terms of the covenant. So many of these basic ideas of freedom and justice actually go back to Sinai, and they've been lost today. They don't go back to Athens.
Yes.
Many people put their fingers on the weaknesses of democracy. That would take longer.
Okay. One last, any burning questions? Yes. You, yeah, go ahead.
I think today, like, if you claim to have the truth, you just get your head bitten off. Like if you say Christianity is the truth, you get someone else saying, how can you claim to have the truth? How could it be the one true religion? Because you have your truth and I have my truth. So what would your
Biblically, now what you're talking about is communication, advocacy, and the old term, apologetics. How do you give an answer to something thrown like that? Well, there's a hint in what I was saying to this gentleman earlier, when you talk of relativism. The answer to relativism is not to say, well, I believe in an absolute truth. He'll answer just as you say he would. But as I said, to relativize the relativizer. You look at something that's biblical, say the prophet Elijah. He has 850 false prophets. He called them false. They called themselves true. All against him, including the king and the queen. So the whole royal court, 850 are against him, and he's one man, and the rest of the people sitting on the fence. What does he do? He doesn't say, come back to God. He says, if Baal is God, follow Baal. Now, how can he do that? He can do that because he knows that Baal is not God. And the quickest way for people to come back to the Lord as God is to see that Baal is not God. So he says, all right, if Baal is God, follow Baal, and gives them the first chance. And when they hit their heads against the wall, then they're open to his showing something else. Now, in the same way I said, Berger says, you relativize the relative. Don't give a Christian answer. Jesus himself said, you don't cast pearls before swine. They're not appropriate. You start with them, what they believe, and push them to be true to what they think they believe, because you know, in fact, in the long term, it's simply not true. But when they see it, their own heads hit the wall, whatever point it is, then they'll be more open. Well, what do you think? Ah, then you can give an answer. So there's a great need for a biblical view of Christian persuasion, how to talk to people in ways that are effective. And a lot of people think that to be faithful is to put it all out. I mean, living in the US, I met many students who say, go to college, and they want to be faithful, and they're in a big anthropology class for 300 people the very first week in college, and the professor will say something about relativism, and they'll say, well, I believe in the Bible as truth. And from then on, the professor will just mock them. Not the thing which to start. You want to start with the problems of what they believe by asking questions which force them back to see it. This is a matter, again, a much longer discussion, apologetics, or the art of persuasion.
Is it burning? I guess it is.
Yes,
Okay.
Just a follow on. Just a
Yeah.
follow on from
Yes.
that. Could you just give an example of relativizing the relativizer, please? So I can write it down.
Elijah's an example.
Yes.
A modern day example.
I gave you examples of Jordan. I'm just trying to think of how many. Well, yeah. Many years ago, I was asked to speak at a series of meetings at York University, which in the 1960s was one of the new universities in England. Most of them very secularist, very humanist, new universities, no tradition. And in the course of the week, there was a professor and his wife who became believers in Jesus. And as they said to me, it was nothing that I said. What was it? Well, they'd been teaching there for a while, and the man was somewhat older than his wife, and they'd had an open marriage. He slept with other women, she slept with other men, and they were quite open about it with each other. And then when the man was in his 50s, and the wife was, they had a little girl. They'd longed to have a little girl all along, and hadn't been able to, but suddenly found, in an odd way, they loved their little girl more, the new baby, more than they loved each other in a strange way. And they knew they couldn't bring this little baby up with the sexual ethics of the 1960s, which is my generation, not my own. And they said because of that, they were then open to thinking for the first time. So they listened to Christians and brushed it all off like water off a duck's back. But suddenly their love for this little baby girl was such, they knew the previous answers they had just simply wouldn't wash. Now, not quite an example of relativizing. I'd like to think a bit longer than that. I probably could if I had time. I've seen many people come to the Lord that way, patiently just saying, all right, you believe this, what then? Until they suddenly see the logic of what they're caring about in an area where they truly care. In other words, apologetics, persuasion, is never just logic. It's, as it were, logic touching life. And that's the point people start to think as they care enough to rethink. Sorry, I'm sure I'll think of an answer 10 minutes after the end of the time.
So with this, first a few thanks. Again, we'd like to thank the Trinity College Christian Union and Georgie for organizing this kindly. We also like to thank Christian Unions Ireland and Dr. David Montgomery, who shepherded this series of talks. There will be more tomorrow and the day after. If you have any questions or would like to attend them, please ask the Christian Union staff. But of course, I think we should all thank this very rare occasion, this occasion that perhaps God has given us to listen to one of our greatest thinkers of our time. Let us all thank Dr. Arthur Guinness again. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the TCDCU Weekly Meeting Podcast.
If you want to know more about us and what we do, be sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and our website, tcdcu.com.